Hello from St. David's on the Hill in Westmead. I'm joining you on a very rainy day, this Wednesday, March 18th, 2020. And I've been talking to a lot of folks in the congregation about the current state of affairs with the COVID-19 situation and not being able to come into church and be with their community. And so I got to thinking about what's kind of underlying a sense of dis-ease and certainly a lot of instability. And I think what's going on is that people are experiencing a kind of grief. And I think the sense of loss of community, the sense of loss of routine and practice and gathering with people that you know and love and who are encouraging and the kind of folks that you have come to count on seeing week after week, or some of you even day after day, can be very unsettling and disruptive to lives that are very typically routine, and we have come to count on routine. So I thought this would be a good opportunity to reflect a little bit on grief, which I've been doing a lot of work on. I want to share with you some readings from Francis Weller's book, The Wild Edge of Sorrow. If you haven't had a chance to come across this book, it's a really beautiful piece of writing, but also be just a great source of wisdom. So I'm going to read 3 readings. They're brief, one is a little bit longer, and have some talking in there as well. I am an advocate of grief, Francis Weller writes. I see the many ways it gifts us. While it is difficult to embrace grief and be moved by its muscular demands, without it, we would not know the heartening quality of compassion, could not experience the full breadth of love, the surprise of joy. We could not celebrate the sheer beauty of the world. Grief fosters each of these capacities, deepening them by bringing gravity to the moment. Grief is the dark color that adds depth to the canvas, providing contrast and texture. Without these tones, our life would be flat and uninteresting. This necessary encounter, in turn, enables these vital qualities to hold us in times of loss and sorrow. I'm not suggesting that we live a life preoccupied with sorrow. I am saying that our refusal to welcome the sorrows that come to us, our inability to move through these experiences with true presence and conscious awareness, condemns us to a life shadowed by grief. Welcoming everything that comes to us is the challenge. This is the secret to being fully alive. I see this work as soul activism, a form of deep resistance to the disconnected way in which our society has conditioned us to live. Grief is subversive, undermining our society's quiet agreement that we will behave and be in control of our emotions. It is an act of protest that declares our refusal to live numb and small. There is something feral about grief, something essentially outside the ordained and sanctioned behaviors of our cultures. Because of that, grief is necessary to the vitality of the soul. So, we've been conditioned, and we play along quite well to the notion of containing ourselves, containing our emotions, although our media has certainly allowed anger and vitriol to infect our social spheres. But grief is something that's often shuttered away, something that's not allowed, something that's seen as a failure to contain one's emotions, a failure to control them. And this is particularly acute in white Western culture. And other cultures have ways of grieving in what a lot of white Westerners might think of as inappropriate, maybe even obscene ways. The public crying of Middle Eastern women, for examples, and the guttural sounds at funerals are things that a lot of us in the West might find disturbing and awkward to listen to. And a lot of that is just because it's not part of our culture. But also what's not part of our culture is the fact that we deny ourselves from any kind of expression of that grief. So I think what's important is that regardless of how it's expressed expressing grief, being in touch with it before you even express it, is what is helpful to your overall living well. If we're seeking to live small lives, then controlling every emotion and containing everything that we experience and stuffing it down is certainly the way to go. But if you want to be what Irenaeus calls God, a human being fully alive, then you'll use all of the gifts that God has given you for emotional, spiritual, mental expression, social expression. And grief is one of those things. As Weller says, it's the dark color that brings texture to the canvas of your life. So how do we approach that grief? How do we get in touch with it? Here's a short reading. Francis Weller calls the idea of getting in touch with grief being an apprentice to sorrow. That sorrow and grief and times of loss have lessons to teach us. And if we can put ourselves in the place of a student, put ourselves in a curious position of learning, then we have something to gain from what the sorrow and the grief is teaching us. So he's quoting John O'Donohue, who I believe is an Irish poet. Actually, yeah, I think he's an Irish poet, amazing writer, actually. So here's the paragraph. An apprenticeship with sorrow invites us to learn the rites of grief and to practice a reverence of approach. An Irish poet, philosopher, John O'Donohue, suggests. He writes, "What you encounter, recognize, or discover depends to a large degree on the quality of your approach. When we approach with reverence, great things decide to approach us. How we approach our sorrows profoundly affects what comes to us in return. We often hold grief at a distance, hoping to avoid our entanglement with this challenging emotion." And isn't that the truth? Grief is incredibly uncomfortable. It sometimes is physically painful. It is profoundly foreign emotion because, once again, our culture is so avoidant of it. But grief is also something that allows us to encounter it and encounter something greater through it when we do approach it. Approaching with reverence, even more so, I think is another way of saying honoring your own experience of grief. So, had a number of people call in this week asking, when can we get together? When can we have the Eucharist? Is there any way we can do home communions? And while I love the notion of being close to the body of Christ in that way, is a beautiful thought that people are actually missing that in a world that says that it's post-Christian and that the church is dying, and in 10 years a third of the churches are going to be gone. That's an incredibly hopeful statement of people who miss the church so much that they're so off-kilter and so destabilized by it. And yet that's also escaping an opportunity here to approach with reverence this sense of grief that we're feeling at not being able to get together is another way of honoring your own feelings. What is it in these feelings of grief that is teaching you something? What are you learning about yourself? What are you learning about your relationship with folks you have here at church or with folks you have with the church? This amazing hill that we live on, the building itself, which is so comforting and beautiful to be in because of its simplicity and minimalism. What are you learning through this loss, through these feelings of sadness at being separated at home and our social distancing? More than that, are you honoring the fact that you even have these feelings? And what does that look like for you? Is it journaling? Is it sitting quietly on the sofa, allowing yourself to cry? Is it sitting quietly with yourself facing the outside for a moment as you eat your lunch alone? What opportunity does this self-isolation offer you to think about what's valuable to you in this community of St. David's or in other communities that you may be separated from as well during this time? Honoring yourself, honoring your feelings, honoring what is given to you as a gift from God to be able to experience a wide range of human experience is something to be approached with reverence, the way you might any provision that God gives us. And then finally, how do you do that? David Whyte, a Welsh poet, has a wonderful poem called The House of Belonging. And he talks about being solitary in his adult aloneness, and how he's inviting people into his home where the sun shines on his table with his teapot. And it's a beautiful image of somebody who is comfortable in their aloneness without being destabilized by it. So in the last reading here, just a paragraph again, Francis Weller talks to us about how to approach this sense of aloneness with reverence. Earlier in this book, I shared the beginning elements in our apprenticeship with sorrow, coming into right relationship with grief, developing a practice to help keep us steady in times of distress, and staying present in our adult selves. Silence and solitude offer the holding space within which we mature these aspects of our learning. They form the vessel for working with the eruptive and difficult material that accompanies grief work. Loss and sorrow pull us inward and downward. There is a natural gravity to sorrow that leads us toward the interior of our lives and nearer to the felt sense of soul. This can be frightening when we know so little about the territories into which we are being escorted. The guardians of silence and solitude. The guardians. Silence and solitude are the guardians that ease our fears and foster a feeling of courage as we move deeper into our experience. Silence and solitude invite us to pause, to slow down, and to stop. How rare this is in a culture that revels in continuous motion. We live in a highly extroverted culture in which everything is expressed and exposed at all times of day and night. This has led to a coarsening of our language and a dilution in substance. What a great way to think about solitude and silence as guardians of this sense of holding space with that which causes us discomfort and dis-ease. So I guess to sum up everything that I've said here is that the feelings of off-kilterness, the feelings of things not being right, maybe you think you're feeling fear, maybe you think you're feeling anxiety, whatever it is that you are feeling, you're invited to explore what those feelings mean, what the loss of community, gathered in person, embodied community, means to you. Let it be the tone that gives your life texture. Let this time, which is sort of an ultimate Lent of sorts, I read in an article last night that it was the ultimate Lent, this forced fasting from company and community. Let it be a lesson that teaches you something deeper about your life. You're invited to go deeper into your life. And as a way of closing, I just wanted to remind you of the words that Jesus said to his friends when he was saying goodbye in that long farewell that he gives in the Gospel of John. And silence and solitude, with silence and solitude as your guardians, let these words also provide guardianship. Peace I leave with you, my peace I give to you. Not as the world gives, do I give to you. Let not your hearts be troubled, neither let them be afraid.